When looking back at everything G.I. Joe accomplished during the 1980s, it's easy to lose yourself in the seemingly countless amount of product that was made available. The toys brought a whole new level of fun, the associated media breathed life into our characters, and the merchandise was literally everywhere. Capping off the decade with yet another full lineup of action figures and vehicles was inevitable, and while the market share in the toy store action figure aisle was getting increasingly competitive, that didn't stop G.I. Joe from giving us some memorable goods to continue growing our roster of heroes and villains during playtime. All of that takes us to the final year of the 1980s. So let's take a closer look at what G.I. Joe toys had to offer in the year of 1989. Let's begin. While it's no secret that sales of G.I. Joe product were stronger in the middle of the decade than it was during 1989, one can still look at the overall roster that was rolled out this year and conclude that there are still many good things to talk about. That being said, things do change as time goes by, and the pop culture climate by 1989 was one indication of this. The world was introduced to new stars occupying airtime on your local radio station, what with singles from artists that we were only beginning to get familiar with. We'd see a return to form at the box office for some timeless heroes who got a nice jolt to their stock and popularity, be it as rebooted stories or showcasing long-awaited sequels. Your home television screen was also subject to some new shows that would be talked about for years and in some cases, decades to follow. In the video game scene, Nintendo would break ground by popularizing the portable, handheld gaming trend with their Game Boy, and further continue to establish Super Mario and his friends as household names. Entertainment would meet sports entertainment when Hulk Hogan took to the big screen in a leading role for No Holds Barred, and in the same year took back the World Championship to further cement his name in the history books. A little closer to home, Hasbro itself would undergo significant changes in 1989. Company CEO Stephen Hassenfeld, who had ultimately made the decision to bring back G.I. Joe earlier in the decade, unfortunately passed away midway through this year, and his brother Alan would take over the company's top position to lead Hasbro into the 1990s. On the front lines of toy design itself, key G.I. Joe designer Mark Pennington had left Hasbro in 1988, though many of Mark's designs would be brought into tangible form in this 1989 year, all of which cements his legacy to this day. Mark is the individual who had taken over for legendary artist and designer Ron Rudat a few years earlier. Other key names would also leave the brand or part ways with Hasbro entirely this year, such as figure sculptor Bill Merkline and Ed Morrill, whose firm was instrumental in G.I. Joe's packaging and branding. All of this would pave the road and lead to a cosmetic shift in the 1990s, a decade filled with bright colors, and when G.I. Joe would begin advertising its spring-loaded accessories as weapons that could really shoot. It also allowed for G.I. Joe's 1989 year to be something of a swan song for this era's real American hero, even if the brand continued on after this point. As for the 89 cast itself, G.I. Joe would continue introducing new sub-teams like what was already being done in the preceding years. Firepower and large accessories were also a theme, and we'd see updated versions of characters who hadn't been featured in toy form since the opening years. On that note, we can most certainly begin with Stalker, who is one of the key field leaders in the Marvel Comics. He's shown dressed for Arctic conditions, being known now as a Tundra Ranger in this version 2 appearance. He comes with a kayak amongst his impressive gear loadout, and it's cool to see him packed in with a vehicle of sorts, even if it is a pretty simple one. Another character finally seeing a return since his 1983 release was Rock and Roll. One of the original Joes alongside Stalker, this one comes with a pair of Gatling guns, making his loadout quite heavy, what with such deadly looking munitions at his disposal. Another of our originals returning was our favorite ninja commando, Snake Eyes. For him, this would be his third version, what with his original 1982 and 1983 straight arm and swivel arm appearances, plus his version 2 that was packed in with timber. And while it's not unusual to see Snake Eyes packed in with both ranged and melee weapons, the multi-piece nunchucks were a nice touch added to a well-established character and G.I. Joe icon. Backblast was added into the lineup this year as an anti-aircraft soldier, sporting a large missile system to take aim and shoot something Cobra related out of the sky. And speaking of the sky, Countdown was an astronaut who would add to the ranks of G.I. Joe's space lineup and who would also serve as an electronics engineer and fighter pilot. Joining him up in space was Payload. Payload's making a return since being packaged in with the Defiant shuttle from 2 years earlier. He was included yet again with another space-themed vehicle, this time the Crusader space shuttle. The Crusader itself was an altered version of the top shuttle portion from the 1987 Defiant and also comes with the recolored version of the 1986 Night Raven reconnaissance jet, and this has also now been repurposed as the Crusader's scout craft. We'll get back to more 1989 vehicles momentarily. And we can come down from space to the deep waters, because Deep 6 received a version 2 release this year as well. A master diver with underwater demolitions capabilities, this version is a much better toy than his original one that only had articulation points at the shoulders. The Joes also added Downtown, a mortar soldier who carried a bunch of shells to fire and had a tripod to set up his attacks from. Recoil was also added this year for the purpose of long-range recon patrol. He's a Joe who's in top physical shape and prides himself on carrying a ton of gear into the field while venturing deep into enemy territory. We've also got Scoop, an information specialist that carries a camera into the field and is the team's news journalist. There's also Dogfight, someone with an unusually high degree of hand-eye coordination. He comes into the year's lineup as the pilot of the Mud Fighter, a craft that dives straight into the heat of battle with guns blazing and bombs dropping everywhere. There's also Hot Seat, a tough guy with a tactical mind. He comes packaged in with the Raider, a heavily armed tank that can detach into a separate scout vehicle as well as a missile rack. Joining Stalker in the cold environments was another Arctic Joe in Wind Chill. His vehicle was the Arctic Blast, capable of holding several Joes, but sometimes Wind Chill would just rather strap on his skis and go at it on his own. We then get to the large vehicle offering this year with the Thunderclap. Coming with the driver known as Long Range, who unflinchingly loves his heavy artillery, the Thunderclap itself is a 3-in-1 set with 2 scouting vehicles and an extendable battlefield cannon as its primary centerpiece. This feature-heavy tracked vehicle is a welcome addition to an already extensive lineup of large G.I. Joe sets offered in prior years. For 1989 mail-aways, we have Rampage. Take note that he does have the same file card real name as Heavy Metal from 1985 and that they are the same figure mold. Rampage is also noted as being the Mauler driver, much like Heavy Metal. Now, also do notice that he doesn't have the microphone that came with Heavy Metal, and he's a noticeably different shade of green and also has some different painted details, which is even more evident when you put the two figures side by side. G.I. Joe also had some battlefield robots this year, and so did Cobra. Starting with the Joe side, you had the Radar Rat and the Tri-Blaster. Now, as we transition over to the sub-teams, Battle Force 2000 got their vehicle edition as well this year with the Pulverizer, which came with an extending turret. Battle Force 2000's figure ranks also expanded with the addition of DJ, a comms tech trooper who enjoys making as well as fixing communications equipment. G.I. Joe's nighttime surveillance team would see a roster expansion as well. With 6 characters in the previous year, we'd see 6 more making their return into the Joe lineup, and these Joes were now all sporting the Night Force sub-team colors. Giving us characters again who initially made their debut earlier in 1988, we have, now in version 2 appearances, Shockwave, Repeater, Muskrat, Charbroil, Lightfoot, as well as Spearhead and Max. Night Force would add some 1989 vehicles such as the Night Boomer, which is a recolor of the 1983 Sky Striker. There's also the Night Scrambler, which is a Night Ops version of the 1983 APC, and the Night Ray, which was a repurposed Cobra hydrofoil. Then there was Tiger Force, who, while not having a figure in the 89 lineup, did have the Tiger Sting, which is a redone version of the Vamp Mark II, as well as the Tigerfish, which is a recolor of the 1986 G.I. Joe Devilfish. A new sub-team would be introduced this year with Slaughter's Marauders. Specializing in fast, rapid offensive attacks, this team would be led by none other than Sergeant Slaughter himself. Now being his 4th version, this would actually be his first carded figure release, given that his prior releases were either all mail-aways or as a figure included with a vehicle. Being the team's most famous drill instructor, when it comes to taking out Cobra, Sarge always means business and is the right person for the job when it comes to leading this team of Marauders. Joining the Marauder ranks now with their green, blue, and brown camo, we'd see the return of Spirit and his Eagle Freedom, as well as Mutt and his K9 Junkyard. The rest of the team would also feature the return of Lowlight, as well as Footloose and Barbecue. The Marauders' vehicles would include another version of the Armadillo, which is done up differently from its 1985 release, what with missile cannons on both sides of the vehicle. There was also the Equalizer, which uses parts from the 1985 Mauler, but like the Marauder Armadillo, also sports different firing weapons, again with the inclusion of missiles on both sides. Then there was the Lynx, which is another tank, and this one utilizes the cannon from the Mauler, albeit with the bottom section of the 1983 Wolverine. And while that tells us about the hero ranks that were offered this year, G.I. Joe still needed somebody to fight. So let's talk about Cobra the Enemy and the upgrades and reinforcements they got in 1989 as well. Since we're already on the topic of sub-teams, Cobra introduced Python Patrol this year, a stealth unit whose equipment hides their presence from G.I. Joe's detection systems. With their special uniforms, we'd see previous characters, albeit mostly army builders, added into the Python ranks. Copperhead returns this year, now as a single carded figure and sporting a backpack and rifle, unlike his version 1 release that came with no accessories but as a driver for the water moccasin. He's the only uniquely named figure in this sub-team, with the rest being army builders. The Python Patrol Trooper here is the sub-team's basic infantryman and for some reason utilizes the same mold as the version 1 Cobra Officer from 1982 and 1983. Meanwhile, the Python Officer here, in a darker color scheme than the Trooper, inexplicably uses the mold of the basic Cobra the Enemy Soldier from 1982 and 1983. Not sure why the G.I. Joe creators at the time swapped the Trooper and Officers from their original designs, but that's what we have. The Crimson Guard also made a Python Patrol appearance as the best of the best as far as shock troopers are concerned. The Televipers also got their Python colors, serving as the radio telecommunications operators for this sub-team's ground forces. And finally, we have the Python Patrol Viper, making a return into the lineup as a recolor of the original 1986 release. This subgroup also had its own share of vehicles. For example, we had the Python Asp, which was originally released as the 1984 Assault System Pod, but now in its new design pattern. This group would also make use of the G.I. Joe 1986 Conquest, but now done up in Python Patrol colors as well. And as a fan favorite, the Stun would be back as well, rounding out the 1989 vehicles for this colorful sub-team. Destro's Iron Grenadiers faction would add a handful of members too. The Annihilator was an elite bodyguard of Destro's, which also was intended as an army builder of sorts, and they came with a portable helicopter pack that could make the Annihilator function as an airborne trooper as well. Destro's mercenary relative, Darklon, also signed up with the Iron Grenadiers, and he comes packed in as the driver for the Evader, which is a unique vehicle that sported some guns and missiles directly on its clamshell-shaped canopy. The group also added a specialized Iron Grenadier known as Wild Boar, whose task is to be the operator of the Razorback. The Razorback is a frontline assault vehicle with an elevation mechanism to allow it to fire from additional angles higher up. The Iron Grenadiers rounded their 1989 lineup with the Targat, or Trans-Atmospheric Rapid Global Assault Trooper, who basically went into battle as a human meteor. And since we're talking about factions, the Dreadnoks added a member this year as well. Gnawgahyde is a skilled hunter and tracker and comes with a ton of accessories, including his boar, which would be his signature animal companion that he was included on card with. Cobra's army builder legions would see some growth as well. A few of these have now become time-tested favorites, such as the brightly dressed Alley Viper, who came in during this 1989 lineup expansion. These urban assault troopers carried a massive shield while looking like something of a specialized SWAT unit and are a key part of executing Cobra's inner city invasions. Heat Vipers serve as the anti-tank specialist ranks for Cobra. Carrying a bazooka and some rockets into combat, their sighting system allows for them to track down G.I. Joe armor units and wipe them off the battlefield. The Night Vipers here are a possible direct enemy of G.I. Joe's Night Force. Their special equipment allows for them to operate covertly under the cover of dark, and when they're not sneaking up on one another as part of their training, they are probably sneaking up to take out some unsuspecting Joe forces before the battle even begins. There was the Frag Viper, Cobra's designated grenade throwers. Their field of expertise lies in their equipment's ability to fire off more grenades in a given minute than most others who specialize in the explosives trade. The Hiss tank saw a remodel known as the Hiss 2. Larger than the original, it sports a triple-barreled cannon, missiles on either side, and has a sliding compartment at the back to hold several more figures. The driver of the Hiss 2 was known as the Track Viper, and while you could buy the Hiss 2 and Track Viper on their own as a set back in 1989, do take note as well that they were also packaged as a 2-pack with the G.I. Joe Mud Fighter in an exclusive box set. Finally, we get to the Aero Viper, a specialized gold-helmeted pilot that comes with the large Condor Z25. The Condor was Cobra's large advanced technology aircraft, and it had forward-swept wings, along with the ability to separate into two smaller vehicles if need be. This is an impressive high-altitude bomber for sure. For other vehicles, the Fang got a version 2 as well, much like the Hiss tank did, and Cobra's battlefield robots, which we touched on earlier, consisted of the Devastator as well as the hovercraft. G.I. Joe also began including micro-figures packaged in with some regular figures. 20 different characters were available, and you could also mail in to get a special poster which featured the micro-figure collection. While that concludes the US domestic toy run, overseas, G.I. Joe would continue to have life as well in European markets with Action Force International Heroes. Similar to before, these would consist of imported G.I. Joe figures that were released to US markets in prior years. The comics by Larry Hama would further Marvel's ongoing G.I. Joe storyline as well, and the backstory between Cobra Commander and Snake Eyes would be fleshed out. Additionally, the original G.I. Joe, named Joe Colton, as well as G.I. Jane are brought into the story, and Python Patrol makes its debut. Animation company Deke would take over where Sunbow left off in the cartoon, releasing a 5-part series known as Operation Dragonfire, which brought Cobra Commander back to the forefront after his inglorious write-off in the 1987 movie. Note that the theme song would embrace the International Hero tagline rather than the usual Real American Hero jingle. All of this would be before we got another full-length series beginning in 1990. Overall, 1989 still showed a ton of solid offerings for the G.I. Joe toy line, effectively closing out a decade of excellence as a leading force in children's entertainment. Yes, for the reasons stated earlier on, the 1990s would bring some changes to G.I. Joe. While that's all still part of G.I. Joe's history, the 1980s as a decade still lends itself to being a well-told story for this line. G.I. Joe brought friends together on the playground, introduced us to a vast range of heroes and villains that would be etched in our memories, and fueled our imaginations with tons of media, all of which makes G.I. Joe a landmark franchise in toy history. And for those reasons, our favorite Real American Heroes, or International Heroes if you prefer, along with the villains they did battle with time and time again, will forever be an exalted cast of characters to its dedicated fan base, a fan base that still celebrates the greatness of G.I. Joe to this day, and hopefully for countless days after. And if you enjoyed this video, don't go anywhere just yet. I'm gonna put another G.I. Joe history video that you can click on right over here, or for a look at an altogether different toy history topic, you can click on this video right over here. And with that, yo Joe, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks again, and take care.